Welcome back to the Belonging at Work Summit. We continue to chat about the future of work, and I am thrilled to welcome my friend and fellow Portlander, Lillian Tsai, who is the founder and CEO of Tsai Communications. Lillian was born and raised in Malaysia and Borneo. She's an award-winning consultant, coach, facilitator, speaker, and trainer. Lillian has worked with hundreds of for-profit, government, and nonprofit organizations on cross-cultural diversity, equity, and inclusion communications for over 12 years. Her life's work is dedicated to bridging across cultures and differences. Given Lillian's superpower of working across cultural differences, we'll talk about how we can build bridges across our differences inside and outside the workplace as we consider what the future of work holds for all of us. During our chat, we'll unpack what cultural differences in the workplace means, why building bridges across differences today matter, and what we can expect as we venture into the future of work. So at the end of our talk, we'll walk away with a new understanding of how we can adopt some of the strategies Lillian uses with her clients to build bridges across the differences we encounter at work and beyond. So Lillian, welcome to the summit. I am thrilled that you said yes and that we're here, and I think we're going to have a great conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Rhodes. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for asking me.
Yeah.
And I'm really honored to be included with this vast, highly well-known, world-renowned panel of people that you've asked to be on this seminar.
Yes, well, I couldn't think of a better person to be a part of this conversation as we kind of look towards the future of work, really thinking about how do we talk across culture, how do we talk across differences, and that is your specialty, and definitely your superpower when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, I think to kick it off, because this is your background, I would love just to hear, in your own words, your definition of what cross-cultural communications in the workplace include when we're thinking about our workplace's diversity, equity, and inclusion values.
Mm-hmm. All right, so cross-cultural communications really describes the manner in which people from different cultures or backgrounds and upbringing interact and communicate with each other. We are all, by the way, unique individual cultures based on how and where we were raised. So for example, urban versus rural versus suburbia, or by region or by country. Yeah. And yet we are all influenced very early in our lives by the values, the morals, and beliefs we were taught by our core and also extended families. For example, I have a 5-year-old grandson now, and trust me, I am very, very involved grandmother, and I've been teaching him all the values from our culture. Yes. So we are influenced by all those things, and also throughout our lives by our lived experiences. So what may prove challenging, though, when working across cultures, as I've experienced and what a lot of my clients experience, is when our values differ in how we demonstrate and express them, even if we have the same values, depending on our culture and upbringing. Let me give you an example. For example, my culture, which I identify as Malaysian Chinese, means that I was brought up believing that children should be seen and not heard. That's what my father told me every single day. Yeah. And that we needed to respect our superiors and elders, both at home and at work. So in the workplace, this meant that I never questioned my manager or opposed their point of view, even if I disagreed. This worked quite well for me when I was working in Malaysia, but not so well here in America, as you can imagine. Mm-hmm. When I kept quiet in a meeting in the US, I was perceived as not confident, I lacked creativity and leadership, or I just didn't have any opinions or ideas to offer. This then meant that I was excluded from the inner circle. I did not feel a sense of belonging on my team, or unless I or my teammates understood these values, which were maybe culturally based, we would be creating silos within our own team. And of course, I never got the promotions. So this is why it's so important to understand what our own values are, first of all, and then also the values of our employees. And more importantly, how do these values show up differently in behaviors? So to do so means that we need to build deeper relationships with each other, which could be as simple as, I love to use this example, slurping noodles together or breaking bread together, and really getting uncomfortable in order to be comfortable later on.
Yeah, that's super valuable. And I really appreciate just kind of going back to this idea of taking the time to get to know who your colleagues are, and slurping noodles, breaking bread, whatever the thing is that brings you together, where you're talking, yes, you're relating about work, but you're getting to know different aspects of who your colleagues are, and understanding some of those differences that they bring, that allow you to kind of step outside of your own comfort zone and learn about the world and learn about different cultures. So I think that's really helpful. And I love your examples. So just kind of going back to and reflecting on your own workplace experiences and kind of the cultural values that you bring to the workplace, and how they were received in the United States, right? And kind of this like mapping out what your own values are, the values of your colleagues, and like thinking about if the workplace has not stated what values are. And I know that there are some folks tuning in right now where maybe there isn't a value statement yet, right? So what is that kind of implicit culture, and how do you navigate that? And that's difficult when it's not clearly stated. Yeah.
Right. And a lot of companies have a list of values, right?
Yep.
And honestly, when I ask them, can you memorize them? Most people can say maybe 2 or 3 out of the 5 or 10. Right. The important thing is, how do each of these values, how do each of these values show up on your team specifically?
Yes.
Right. And have you talked about it? Have you talked about the expectations of those behaviors? Because if you don't have a common understanding where everybody is demonstrating those behaviors in the same way, then you're going to have a lot of misunderstanding.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that another speaker that we have for today is Erica Keswin. And so she often talks about taking your values off the walls and bringing them into the halls. So kind of like walking your talk, right?
Yes, I love that.
Yeah, I think it's great. It's a great way to kind of think about this. So in your consulting practice, you're often working with HR leaders and helping them prepare for what we know the future holds in the United States and beyond, that our workforce is becoming increasingly diverse. So when you're working with these stakeholders, walk us through what some of the fears, worries, or concerns that candidly they share with you about how well they're doing now in navigating across cultural differences, and what they anticipate will pop up in the future as they kind of map this out.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question, because recently I had the opportunity to interview 3 of my HR friends who are leaders in their field in small and large organizations. So let me address this question in 2 parts. And also I like to include diversity, equity, inclusion, which I'm going to short form by saying DEI, to the mix. All right. So first of all, let's address the roles and responsibilities for HR, which is where I believe those fears, worries, and concerns usually come from. So if you think about what HR's role traditionally has been, it's been as an incubator of policy and systems in which employees operate, right? So HR is really about prevention, competence, and compliance. Prevention of lawsuits and complaints, ensuring that an organization complies with the laws that organizations are bound by. The HR's role then is to protect a company and its leaders from these unfortunate instances that might end up in news or in a lawsuit. Right. HR is and has been the core functioning body responsible also for organizational and skills development. So as a result, because of this focus on compliance, perhaps the topic of cultural responsiveness, another term for cultural competency, or DEI, has not been a top priority unless somebody is working in a multicultural or global company that requires these skill sets.
Right.
And so compounding all of these over the last 10 years, we've now added the broad and deep topic of DEI, a field that requires at least some knowledge of anthropology, social science, psychology, sociology, social and racial justice. And I would add that most formal HR education programs or degrees lack a deep dive into DEI and or intercultural communications, which is the field that I've studied, and in many cases, if at all. For example, a bachelor's degree in HR includes labor management, compensation, employment law, and employee development. You might also take some core classes in, say, accounting, statistics, or IT. And I know that many of my HR friends will go on to take additional courses and also get a certification from SHRM, which is the Society for Human Resource Management,
Right.
At various levels. So HR really has a tough job because they're dealing with compliance, and many do not have that certification in DEI or intercultural communications. However, several of my friends who are HR professionals have been very successful in intentionally adding these to their repertoire. And today they really are moving fast and upward in the careers. So I would encourage any HR professionals who are either starting out in their careers or even seasoned practitioners to really think about adding a DEI certificate to their repertoire.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then the other thing I would say is that I believe that HR's role then is to put an emphasis and intentionality to ensure equity and inclusion is embedded into policies, practices, and systems. They should be the driver of an equitable, inclusive environment on how these policies and systems are constructed and implemented, and working in lockstep collaboration with the DEI team and leadership to make this happen. Mm-hmm. So in order to do this successfully and to alleviate fears and worries about stepping on it, I believe HR professionals need to be open in talking about what I've experienced as the elephant in the room, which is basically a tension that exists between HR and the DEI function, which many companies today have added out of necessity and need. Mm-hmm. So where does this tension come from? It may originate from a perceived difference of focus. The roles and responsibilities may overlap. People don't know if they're stepping on each other's toes, with HR being focused on compliance and prevention, and DEI on ensuring inclusive and equitable policy in the practices. However, I think people are starting to understand that these do intersect, and in order to work well together, HR must think differently and reframe the thinking and the mindset that's hardwired in the ecosystem to think of people first. And then what is the impact of those policies and systems and programs on DEI? Yeah. So HR really has the ability to be the driver of identifying and articulating the values that an organization and workforce is exhibiting.
Yeah, I'm just furiously taking notes because I love what you're saying, kind of where the fears, worries, or concerns are coming from, starting with like just being realistic about the kind of formal education that at least folks in HR are getting, versus kind of this ongoing learning that's now available largely because of folks like us in the field of kind of compiling what we've learned over the past several decades around how to build more inclusive organizations. And now there are certification programs. We're starting to see more formal programs in colleges and universities. So that's very promising. But like you said, it doesn't really speak to the elephant in the room for HR folks, where it's like being trained to kind of think about liability and kind of protecting an organization before centering your people, and kind of the emerging kind of promising practices we're learning from kind of the DEI space is like center your people and think about your entire ecosystem. So HR is a component of that, but it's not the be all or end all. I mean, you're thinking about what your organization does. So if you're serving people, you have a marketplace along with the workforce. And then you also have kind of on your procurement side, if you're a larger organization, those suppliers you're working with, those are all people, right?
That's right.
And so, and then kind of like adding this kind of the piece around belongingness and who has traditionally been excluded, and how do we change that? And I think that's where maybe HR knows that they play a role in that, but it's kind of like, how do we start? Where do we go? And it sounds like you've been kind of the HR whisperer in some ways, and like trying to guide them through what they may not know, and raising awareness and hopefully changing behaviors that way. So I want to kind of continue this conversation and dive into demographic shifts, because today is all about the future of work.
Right.
And we're thinking about this in a number of different ways. But I really wanted to focus our conversation around some of the key demographic shifts that we're seeing in our workforce, and recognizing that these shifts happen slowly, but over time, they become compounded, and there's a massive difference between
Right.
what the workforce today looks like and what it will look like in 2050, right? Or beyond.
Right. Correct.
And so from your vantage point, what are some of the biggest demographic disruptors employers today should prepare for in order to more effectively search and attract the workers of tomorrow?
I would say that there are several disruptors that I've identified, and they will likely extend into the rest of the 21st century. And by the way, they all do intersect with each other. First and foremost is the existence in today's workplace of a 4 or 5 generational workforce, consisting of the oldest, who are called traditionalists, and then we've got our boomers, and I'm one of them. And you've got your Gen Xers, your millennials, also called the Gen Ys, and the Gen Zs are now starting to come into the workplace. So because of these differences, and whenever there's difference, there's going to be conflict, right? These intergenerational conflict and misunderstandings are and seem to be a reoccurring theme in when I do organizational-wide DEI assessments. And I've been doing these for, I would say, the last 10 years. It doesn't matter whether it's a for-profit, a nonprofit, or a government or public agency, there seems to be across the board so much finger-pointing about what the other generation should or shouldn't do, how they think, how they do their jobs, how they communicate, how they conduct themselves. And sadly, I found that a lot of these perceptions really stem from stereotypes and assumptions about each other. And so what organizations need to do is really provide training to help everybody understand that it's really based on a matter of how, where, and when we were raised. So the values that I spoke about earlier, that we learned from an early age, and really more importantly, what was going on at that time when these generations were born. For example, how did World War II or I or the Vietnam War or the internet ground each generation in our values? And how do these values then influence our behaviors and our communication preferences? For example, younger generations have been said to prefer texting to email, and boomers and traditionalists prefer face-to-face or phone calls. Well, guess what? Not everybody, not all, Gen Ys and Gen Xers prefer texting. Some of them prefer face-to-face and phone calls. So having this understanding will enable all of us to better understand each other, so we can reduce the finger pointing, because it's really not productive. And as I said before, it's also about the importance of developing relationships across these generations so that we can better understand each other's working and communication styles that will help reduce those biases, stereotypes, assumptions, and those negative judgments. The second disruptor, I believe, and I'm sure this is no surprise to you, is technology. So there was a Glassdoor article that I read called 5 Hiring Trends That Define 2017. And the number one trend was that tech jobs are spreading, and every industry is now trying to transform itself into a tech industry in some measure, using software, automation, mobile apps, and big data to automate, to analyze, so they can make smarter decisions and at the end of the day, drive value to the customers, right? So with the onset of artificial intelligence, AI, and there are so many tools now to help us recruit and retain an increasingly diverse workforce. And these tools are starting to show up every single day. And I'll mention a couple here. Actually, the one I'd like to mention is Textio, Textio, which is an algorithm-based AI which intersects with unconscious bias and also gender-neutral job postings. For example, using the word collaborates in a job description may be more attractive to women than one that says drives results, and avoiding words like rock star, takes risks, or VIP, versus more gender-neutral and inclusive words such as adaptable, creative, imaginative, curiosity, and all that. So I'll mention some of these tools later.
Yeah, and I think like on those first two, just for continuity of the summit itself, tomorrow when we're talking about allies, we actually are featuring Lori Battaglia, and she is talking about how to be generational allies. So I think that that's really relevant to what you're talking about, and the power of reverse mentorship and building those relationships.
Right.
And on the technology piece too, there we're featuring Vivian Ming actually today. So she's already spoken. So people, if they're going through the summit linearly, she talks a lot about the disruption of technology and where we as kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals can come in to ensure that some of the technology, the software, the automation, really keeping a close eye of who's designing it, making sure that there's diverse perspectives, that we're not leaving out important perspectives from underrepresented communities in the workplace, because we want to go really fast and just develop the thing, but being a little more intentional and slowing down to have a more positive impact. So, so those are 2 examples. You said you had 5. So what were the other?
Before I leave this technology thing,
one thing
of other people who are more focused on technology have mentioned is talking to my HR friends, they do believe that close partnerships between IT, HR, and DEI need to happen to determine how AI plays a role in advancing DEI, which always ties back to HR's functions, right? How do we use these AI tools to help in sourcing, selection, and hiring, and also becoming a watchdog, so to speak, when people make selections through an unconscious bias lens? How do we proactively look at how we are triggered and reflecting on this through a post-mortem, so to speak, and examining where do these unconscious biases have played a role? Where would they have played a role? And then asking these hiring managers to reflect and revise their hiring the selections, if unconscious bias was at play. So these tools are already available to attract talent. And it's such a time saver, right? Because AI is now analyzing the data for us instead of us doing it ourselves. So, but the bigger question before we leave this is, how are we preparing our leaders and employees for this more automated universe? Since many of us believe we're already behind the ball. How do we think about automation and AI early enough? What do they look like? And what, more importantly, how do we still create a sense of belonging in a future workforce that's increasingly automated, right? So if I had those answers, I'd be a millionaire by now.
Well, that's why we're all here. We're kind of working together to figure it out and help provide guidance to the folks that you work with and others really committed to doing this work, but not totally sure where to start or what actions they can take, recognizing what their role is and what it isn't. And so I think really being able to identify some of these disruptors when we think about an increasingly diverse workplace and how to prepare now. It's not too late. I mean, if you're just getting started, great, get started, but don't delay. I think that's the piece, is that in order to remain relevant, you have to anticipate what tomorrow will look like and do the work, right? On the kind of, I'm really grateful that you mentioned kind of the 4 or 5 generations that are currently under kind of the workplace. I don't know, the proverbial rooftop, I guess. But when we're thinking about age in the workplace and how everything will change in the next half a century, we know in the United States that the workforce is aging. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, and I think it's really nice that you do a lot of work with HR, aside from training, aside from understanding, okay, we know that the workplace, our workforce is aging, what might employers be able to do to recognize, okay, we have a lot of valuable employees who are aging. What are some of the policies that we can change? What are employee benefits we can add? Can we have flexibility just to kind of accommodate? What are you seeing now, or what would you recommend for the future to prepare for this aspect of change?
Right. So this is, I'm so glad you asked this question, because it's so important, especially since I'm a baby boomer, right? And ageism is happening both ways, right? Finger pointing is going both ways. So it's alive and well. And it's interesting because I'm currently working with a company, and somebody who's 40, only 40, right, is perceived as the old folk, is the oldie. And so if your company's average age is younger, 30 to 35, somebody who's 45 recently said that he was called the old man in the group, and he said it with a very sad face. So with us living longer, so it's inevitable that there are more and more people over age 55 in the workforce. What's interesting is that as the wages of older workers peter out, the number of them in the workforce are only growing. And I'm sure people know this, but 10,000 baby boomers turn 65 every single day.
Wow.
And more than half of the 11.4 million jobs expected to be added to the US economy over the next 7 years will be filled by workers over 55. And yet, many workers over 50 report experiencing microaggressions and bias, as I just mentioned, every single day. They're being ignored and asked when they're going to retire, or accused of being afraid of technology. So there's a report from the New School for Social Research that older workers are also stuck in what they call pay purgatory, which means wages for workers between 55 and 65 only grew by 0.8% over a 12-year period. Wow. Between 2007 and 2019, whereas wages for 35 to 54-year-olds saw a 4.7% jump during the same period. So in a related CNBC report, the disparity comes down to bargaining power. Right? So older Americans with limited retirement savings have less of a financial cushion to fall back on. Employers seem to know it. So, and also many senior workers are less willing or able to move for work, and therefore further limiting their options. So here are some ideas on what companies should do. Number one is examine their recruitment practices. Do their websites include photos of an age-diverse workforce, or is everybody on it young and white, right? So do your job applications ask age-related questions such as your date of birth or when a person graduated from college or high school? Is your interview panel age diverse? Are you training recruiters and interviewers to avoid ageist assumptions such that a younger worker will work for a lower salary, or that an older worker will not remain on the job for long? And then the second thing is include age as part of your diversity inclusion program and efforts. PricewaterhouseCoopers 2015 annual global CEO survey found that while 64% of the 1,322 CEOs from 77 countries had a D&I inclusion strategy at the company, only 8% included age in the strategies. Wow. Then the next point is, suggestion is offer learning and development to all employees, including career counseling, and you mentioned it, reverse age mentoring, or what we call collaborative mentoring. And then lastly, you can find a way to honor older, long-term tenured workers' legacy at the company when he or she has been in the company for decades, and ensure that not being taken for granted. I was working with a design firm that had several senior designers who were actually in the 70s. They've been there since the beginning. However, they're being edged out by new technologically savvy employees and new design ideas that they want to introduce. And so they ended up being very frustrated and, of course, acting out by shouting, using disparaging remarks, and people accused them of throwing people under the bus. So it's interesting because when I interviewed one of them, I asked him this question. I said, what legacy would you like to leave behind when you leave? And nobody had ever asked him that question. And he said that, I just want to be respected and remembered for what I did for this firm. I don't want to disappear into the night. And by the way, he was encouraged to retire within the year, and he wasn't really ready to. He had won all types of awards for the company. And he then shared with a sad face that people stopped listening to his ideas. He did not feel that sense of belonging. And he wasn't allowed to lead anymore. And so, he had a lot of pride in his work. So how do you prolong and that legacy and let him leave with his sense of pride intact?
Yeah. I think that's a really great question to pose to anyone who is tuning in right now, is kind of, in addition to the great, everyday work that you're doing, what is the legacy you want to leave behind in your organization? And who could you work with to make that a possibility? But it kind of goes back to that visualization of getting really clear. And I mean, you've provided such great examples of when belonging is missing, right? And just kind of in that last example you shared of not having your ideas when you've shared them, and having such experience like this particular individual, that just kind of landing flat and people not even kind of reflecting back of like, oh, that's a good idea, maybe we can adapt it. It just kind of falls on people just not taking any action around it. And that's so what's the reverse? How can we think about when we share ideas that all of our ideas are valued in a way that we feel respected? So I want to kind of continue on some of the demographic shifts that we're expecting, and part of kind of looking ahead is we have to kind of look behind at some trends. And since the 1960s, we know that changing immigration patterns in the United States, a growing number of women have entered the workforce since 1960 as well. And employment non-discrimination protections now include, depending where you live, but for most across the country, protections on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, etc. So this has all contributed to an increasingly diverse workforce here in the United States and also more broadly. So kind of recognizing that the future workforce will be increasingly diverse and global because of technology enhancements. What can employers do today to build bridges across these demographic differences that are only going to increase over the next few decades?
Right. So I'm a big proponent, of course, of training and development, right? Training and education that's really beyond that check in the box, beyond just building awareness. Awareness is always the first step, but I get very frustrated when people say, okay, come in, do the 1 hour training. You're not going to learn anything. Right. And so the knowledge acquisition then needs to include, in addition to basic differences in how we human beings interact. It's all about human behavior based on our socialization since our birth, right? So these trainings have to be experiential. They have to be discussion and activity based and customized according to an organization's mission, business goals, and core values. The second thing I think is, what I said earlier about building those relationships is having conversations, which I find interestingly, a lot of people are afraid to have, and I don't know if this exists in other parts of the country, but you and I live in what we call the Pacific nice, right? Pacific Northwest nice, or Portland polite, culture, where people don't have those difficult conversations. But in order to bridge across these differences, really understanding our work preferences, for example, how do you and I prefer to problem solve? Is that any different? What is your approach to managing conflict and misunderstanding? Do you lean in, or do you step in, or do you avoid? And do I accommodate or collaborate? And then the other thing that's very important is, do I have a direct style? What style do you have? It's complete opposite, then where are we going to meet in the middle? Right? And also, do we know when to code switch and frame switch to adapt to somebody else's style that's different from mine? Or do I insist that my way is the only and the best way? And then the other thing is really relating back to values, right? What are my team members' cultural values and beliefs? Do we all know what they are? How are they driving behaviors? And might that be at the root of whatever misunderstanding is occurring? Let me give you an example. I was coaching a foreign-born manager who was born and raised in a very patriarchal and hierarchical culture. He had no idea that his leadership style was that of command and control, and that his team perceived him to be a dictator and control freak. So he started losing his best employees, and only when they asked me to work with him and coach him did he realize that, based on the values that he grew up with and how he started working in the workplace, that what came naturally to him was acceptable in his birth country, but was perceived as hierarchical in a more egalitarian cultural mindset like the one we work in.
I really appreciate that example, and it reminds me, we're talking about both living in Portland, and I moved recently, well, I guess within the past 5 years, from New York City to the Pacific Northwest, and it is, I have been so trained to be super direct, right? And just kind of those geographical differences of direct in New York is business as usual, direct in the Pacific Northwest is rude, and it's kind of like adjusting and and really having an appreciation for the culture that you're in particular, if it's not your own, and having that humility of just kind of getting curious and trying to understand. And I think, again, it goes back to this relationship building that you're talking about. But really, one, it's kind of the traits of inclusive leadership of being curious about the other person.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, like, on the awareness side, in the example that you shared with the person that you were coaching, he just wasn't aware that
Mm-hmm.
how he was raised and where he was raised, the country he was raised in, that leadership style just didn't work in terms of where he was
Mm-hmm.
currently at. And kind of for you to be in that role to help him, it probably opened his eyes, and he's like, I just didn't know. And, when you know better, you do better, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's kind of the bottom line there. So,
Exactly.
yeah, I think that's really helpful. So let's talk a little bit more about looking at employers and HR leaders in particular, just given kind of that's more of your background. How might employers leverage data for workforce planning to prepare for the future demographic shifts? So you talked a little bit about the training and going beyond awareness raising and really customizing trainings. Obviously, employer data is a tool to kind of help understand your particular organization, kind of who is there now, who might be there in the future. So are you seeing this, I guess, like big data, little data, whatever data is being collected by an employer? Are you seeing more folks kind of looking within to kind of anticipate future trends just in their sector or in their particular organization?
Yeah, I think it's yes and no, right? It depends on who you're talking to. The larger companies or the companies who are more tech savvy or futuristic looking are more prone to thinking ahead. But there are, smaller companies that I also work with who don't have the benefit of the funds to do that. So I would say I've been doing a lot of organization-wide assessments, and they've all really been based on qualitative and quantitative data, which is, simple things like focus groups, one-on-one confidential interviews, and then the proverbial, survey monkey, the online survey, which I still need to have my assistant and I really analyze and say, okay, what are we looking at here? What's the link between the quantitative and qualitative data? That's what I'm hoping that these new tools will be able to do. So I identified a few tools that do exist today. And the first one is really, this tool was developed by the Center on Aging and Work at Boston College and AARP. And they partnered to develop an assessment tool, which, by the way, is complementary to measure a company's commitment to flexibility in hiring, recruitment, training, development, competitive compensation, and benefits fairly across age, right? We've been talking about age, and since age is a passion of mine, I'm going to focus on that again. And so how do these meet the employee's need regardless of the stage in which they're in their career? So it assesses, and the beauty of this tool is also assesses and compares your company's result with companies in your specific industry. So you go online and it's very easy to use. The first thing they ask is, what is your industry, right? So here's a couple of other tools in addition to Textio that I mentioned above that address and reduce bias in companies. So the first one is Joonko, Joonko. It's a real-time D&I, diversity inclusion coach for companies that can identify conscious or unconscious bias events as they happen. And they also provide on-the-spot assessment and feedback to prevent it from damaging the business. So a manager can set notification alerts, encouraging people to offer opportunities as the right opportunity arises. And the alerts may be sent when one person on the team is consistently, for example, assigned fewer or less critical tasks. And so they automatically get a message from Joonko. It's like an email message. Oh, by the way, I've noticed that, for example, you're trying to schedule a meeting across your team members. And by the way, this member happens to take every Thursday afternoon off because they have a parent who needs to go to a medical exam or medical appointment. So you might want to avoid that time. I mean, It goes down to that level of granularity.
Yeah.
Then the second tool is called Loom, Loom, the culture map, which uses machine learning to help leaders, diversity practitioners, and HR professionals how to map, measure, and improve their workplace culture. So this reporting tool quantifies organizational culture across 11 categories and 80 competencies. So the reports are then automatically generated by Loom to give organizations the ability to assess the team dynamics, employee engagement, identify some of the strengths and opportunities of leadership, and to pinpoint trends toward demographic groups and identify actionable improvement strategies. So it's developed by a company called TMI Consulting.
That's great. These are really, really helpful tools that if your organization is not currently collecting anything, it sounds like these are a good place to start. And Junko in particular, getting that kind of real-time support as well is probably a pretty good economy of scale if you don't have a massive budget like a Fortune 100 company. So I think those are really, really great in terms of kind of collecting data and then doing something powerful with it as it relates to building a culture of belonging. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the kind of global human capital trends that we're seeing. And in 2017, Deloitte actually published a survey of 10,400 executives who reported that they had weak programs in their talent development pipeline for underrepresented groups. And so kind of looking at generations, millennials, looking across gender, women, people of color, people with disabilities, LGBT folks. So given that stat, how can employers develop cross-generational and diverse talent pipelines to ensure that their workforce reflects the different communities and populations that they're serving?
Yeah, we could spend hours talking about this, right? Taking each of those pieces, right? It is. So I'm going to keep it short. One of the things that I've been recommending to all my clients post organizational assessment is something called stay interviews. And I've been reading more and more that it's a way to have meaningful conversations with employees at all levels, from all age groups and backgrounds, about what's really keeping you here, right? What would keep you here? What are your career goals? What resources do you think you need? And if they don't know, who can I put you in touch with so that they can give you some advice and coaching and mentoring? And if they do know, where do you think you want to develop? What skill sets and what level, if you want to get to the next level, we can make some recommendations on what some of the things that you want to do. And there are a lot of employees now who maybe work in a larger company who say, well, I'm tired of this department and I have my eye on something that's completely different. What are some of the skill sets that I need to develop to get there, right? And is the company willing to send them to training or attend courses at the local university or community college so that they can expand the knowledge and skill base? So these are things, for example, that a lot of underrepresented groups may not have the courage, may not have the means financially to go after themselves. So if a company can, help them get there, they're going to be much more loyal, right? Yeah. And so the next thing I would say is, are people having, and this relates to what I said about the Pacific Northwest NICE, is how are you having more courageous conversations with your employees about what's working well for you? What in your mind needs to be different, and what will you change? If you had a magic wand, and I love to ask this question, if you had a magic wand and you can change anything you want in this company, what would you change? So this type of conversation helps employees feel like they're included, that they matter. And of course, it creates that sense of belonging that, oh, people really do care about me as a person and not just another number. So by having these stay interviews and courageous conversations and inclusive conversations, we engender loyalty and trust and a desire to do well.
Yeah, I love that question. And this is something I really encourage folks that I work with of envisioning something that looks positive rather than kind of like pointing out the things that people want to quote unquote fix. What is it that you are working towards to building that culture of belonging, and when you've succeeded, what does that actually look, feel, what does it smell like, really visualizing it from all five senses and beyond. And I'm just curious on that question, when you do ask folks, if they had a magic wand, what would they change? Do you find that people kind of just are caught off guard because they haven't been asked a question to really think positively?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
But after the initial shock, right?
Yeah, right.
Of that question, they can think of at least 2 or 3 things that they would change. And I've incorporated this into my trainings on, for example, I am now helping organizations define DEI at the very, very basic level. So when we have this piece on module on equity, I'll say, okay, you're now going to sit with people from your team, if possible, and you're now going to identify what is equitable in your department.
Yeah.
Okay, what does equity look like? How does it show up? And then I'll say, I'll tell them to now on the next chart, write down what are the things that are not equitable and what are some of the things that you would like to change, right? If you had that magic wand, what are some of the things that you'll like to change? And then sometimes I get this laughter, right? Oh, if only, this will never happen. So there's a lot of skepticism, but the thing is, as I remind people, if you don't ask, you'll never, right? You'll never get an answer.
Absolutely.
You'll never know.
Yeah. And I think like that speaks a lot to get people to that place where they can start naming it. It speaks a lot to your skill of building that kind of safety and trust from the get-go. Oftentimes when you're kind of an unknown facilitator coming in, or you may have a relationship with a few people, but you're working across a big organization. So, so kudos to you for getting folks to kind of step outside and getting in that uncomfortable place, because I think that's really where the magic happens in doing this work. So just a few more questions for you, Lillian. So, provided we can successfully build bridges across cultural differences, so using some of the strategies that you've shared with us already, what are some of the silver linings that demographic shifts for the future hold for the workplace, and what it can be, on the positive side?
Right. I would say, given that we are focused on developing underserved populations, right, we're also increasingly giving them better access to higher education. We're already beginning to see increasing innovation and creativity in workplaces. So, for example, a client of mine who's a public agency recently, they serve a predominantly Hispanic customer base, and recently hired somebody who was a native Spanish speaker, finally, right? Somebody who speaks that on the team. And she happened to be the first college graduate in her family who were immigrants from Central America. Nice. So not only did she help to translate documents, create Spanish language posters, and interpret phone calls from customers, she also had some highly creative ideas for outreach to members of a community to organize and plan events that addressed specific needs of the community. For example, this organization has a lot of programs and classes they offer every single year seasonally. So what they did was, because she was there, they opened up a Spanish speaking line on registration day. Whereas before, members of the Spanish speaking community had to call in, and they weren't always understood, or they couldn't understand, because some of these questions even I have difficulty answering, right? So when they called in, so now they're able to stand in line, speak to somebody who speaks Spanish, they can sign up for programs, ask questions, which makes it a lot easier than trying to do it online or even by the phone. Then the other silver lining, I would say, will be when we expose ourselves to so many different languages, cultures, subcultures, that I would hope that it opens up hearts and minds to different ways of doing and being. It really encourages curiosity and open-mindedness, and hopefully then, this is a dream of mine, it will reduce the stereotypes, biases, prejudice, and polarized mindsets that we've been experiencing for so long. I mean, we live in very interesting times right now. And how can we bring people to the middle? How can we, and this is my 3/8 tool, which is how do we acknowledge, accept, and adapt to differences?
And I think that this is the work of our time. right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of
Mm-hmm.
bridging divides and bridging across differences. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all throughout this interview, you've given us really concrete actions that any of us can take in terms of just starting a relationship, starting to build a relationship with a colleague that maybe you haven't, taken the time to get to know, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what can you learn from them? And just that constant curiosity and openness. I mean, that's the start of really experiencing the world from a different perspective than your own. And I think that that's incredibly valuable.
Mm-hmm.
And again, for some of us, that could be a space that's uncomfortable, and that's okay. That's when you're learning and that's when you're growing. So
Right.
that's a good thing.
Right.
So wow. Okay. So we've talked about so much, and I know that we can keep talking about even
Yes.
more good stuff. So, I do want to give you, space to kind of share, maybe one thing that we haven't discussed about the future of work and some of these demographic shifts that we're anticipating,
Mm-hmm.
that you really believe strongly you want to leave with our audience to
Mm-hmm.
feel inspired and
Mm-hmm.
empowered to keep making the change that they want to make in their workplaces. So,
Right.
anything come top of mind to you?
Yeah, it does. And it keeps, and I've experienced this myself, and that's why I have passion for this, is paying attention to the mental health and well-being of
Yes.
workers, right?
Yeah.
It is so key. We live in this fast moving, extremely, I mean, there's information hitting us at every single second, and we can barely keep up. We have very stressful lives. And according to research by Harvard Business Review, pay isn't the primary motivator at work anymore. It's really having, in addition to great career opportunities and senior leadership that employees can believe in, a healthy workplace culture and values. Right? I mean, we've been talking about values all day, and I really wanted to emphasize the need for a healthy workplace, because stress, according to research from Harvard and Stanford in 2015, this article in February called "Why Your Workplace Might Be Killing You" tells us that health issues from job stress are comparable to fourth and fifth causes of death in the USA, which are heart disease and accidents.
Wow.
Right? It's more than deaths from diabetes and Alzheimer's or the flu. I mean, that's an alarming statistic. Right. And so if there are people around you who are having frequent colds, they have acid reflux, and a lot of these symptoms you can't even see, right? They have high blood pressure, they're chronically ill, they call in sick all the time. What's really going on? And a lot of that, according to Dr. Dara Wing Su, who's the author of Microaggressions in the Workplace, is really from microaggressions, and that unconscious bias. So are we paying attention to people's mental health? Because many times we are afraid, and many cultures like mine, mental health is a bad word. You never talk about it. We sweep it under the rug.
Right. I'm really glad that you mentioned that. And, this is a topic that's really central to this summit. On Friday, we're talking all about self-care strategies and
Right.
community self-care as well, right? And our role and our responsibility, but starting with ourselves and taking care of ourselves. So, and I think for you, for me, and for so many people that are watching right now, we are change makers. We're change agents. Whatever title you want to have, I say belonging champions. It's like, this is not easy work, but it's incredibly fulfilling work when you've had a breakthrough, you've opened a heart, you've opened a mind, and you see change happening. But really, this is not a sprint, right? I mean, this kind of change does not happen overnight. So it's really important to have a long game of both how you can, intentionally, change your culture and your organization if that's what you're most passionate about. But it's also a long game of how do you sustain yourself over time, right? So I think there's a Michael Moore quote that talks about, when we're singing in a chorus or a choir and we're holding a note, none of us are expected to hold a note for, I don't know, like 16 beats alone, but we have each other to kind of lean on. So when we need to stop and take a breath, other people are stepping up at that moment. And when we're ready, we can jump back in. So I think, it's a simple analogy, but I think that that's something that, it really underscores your last point, which is around mental health, well-being, and working towards establishing values that are off the walls in your halls, like you're living them.
Mm-hmm.
And, that kind of creates a healthier workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it doesn't happen overnight, but if we can stay focused on it and be accountable to each other, I think that's where we can see those changes.
Mm-hmm.
This is awesome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing so much of your wisdom and your knowledge with us. I'm sure there's a lot of people who are curious about where to find you. They may want to work with you. So where's the best place, like the one best place that you encourage folks to go online just to learn a little bit more about your work?
Well, there's two places. Unfortunately, like a lot of us, the website, always needs updating. So you can go there first, but it's not the best place. I would say link in with me, connect with me through LinkedIn, send me an email, send me a text. And I usually respond within 24, 48 hours. I am leaving the country next week to go to Rwanda for the very first time, actually, for a global diversity dialogue. And I'm so excited. Never been to Africa before. But cool. Thank you, Rhodes, for this wonderful opportunity. And it's great to interact with you and the audience.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you, Lillian. And for everyone watching, thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. Don't forget, if you want more time with these talks, if you'd like additional resources for doing this work in your organizations, and if you'd like to join our community calls after the summit, you can check out your options for getting extended access to all of these sessions and other helpful goodies by using the link that's included below here. And for every purchase that you make, it helps me pay for the speakers like Lillian for their incredible generosity, wisdom, and the labor that they've invested in helping us grow the belonging movement. So Lillian, again, thank you so much for your time and for inspiring everyone today and just for being an incredible belonging champion. Really great to hear.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rhodes. Take care.
You.